Have you ever been told directly or indirectly that you don't belong? Imagine boarding a plane, sliding into your assigned seat, and then being told to move, not because you were wrong, but because someone else believed they deserved it more. That's exactly what happened when Elena Carter, a calm and accomplished black woman, took her seat in 2A. A wealthy passenger insisted she stand up, demanded she step aside. The crew pressured her to, and in that moment, Elena faced a choice: yield to the pressure, or hold her ground in silence. But here's the question. What would you have done? Would you move to keep the peace, or would you stay, even as the entire cabin watched? Because sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with fists or anger, but with stillness, dignity, and the courage to say, I belong here. This is not just a story about one flight. It's about all of us, and the quiet moments where we must decide whether to surrender or to stay seated in the place we've earned. Stay with me as we uncover this powerful journey. And before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe so more people can walk with us through stories that matter. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Overhead bins clicked shut. The air smelled faintly of coffee and the leather polish of the first-class cabin. It was the kind of early afternoon flight where people wanted nothing more than peace, a book, or a quiet nap before reaching Dallas. Elena Carter sat by the window, seat 2A. She placed her small leather bag carefully under the seat in front of her, slid her phone into airplane mode, and took a slow breath. Flying had become routine for her, too routine. Perhaps, but she always savored the rare quiet moments before takeoff. Her eyes lingered on the tarmac. She thought about the meeting waiting in Dallas, the board members, the long agenda. She had been in rooms like those for years now. She knew what to expect, what she never expected, even after decades of climbing ladders and breaking ceilings, was how often the world still tried to push her back into a box she had never belonged in. "Excuse me." The voice cut sharp against the cabin's quiet. Elena turned. Standing over her was a tall woman in her late 50s, dressed in a tailored cream-colored suit, diamond earrings catching the overhead light. Her tone wasn't a question, it was an order. "You're in my seat." Elena blinked. She smiled politely, thinking it must be a mistake. "This is seat 2A, she said gently. "It matches my boarding pass." The woman, Margaret Whitmore, arched an eyebrow, lips tightening as though she had just tasted something bitter. "No, dear. You must have read it wrong. This is my seat." Her voice carried enough force to turn a few nearby heads. Elena felt the shift in the air, the way curious eyes landed on her, some lingering, some flicking away quickly. Elena slid the folded boarding pass from the pocket of her blazer, keeping her movements calm. She opened it, pointed. "Seat 2A. That's what it says." Margaret's smile was thin, dismissive. "Sweetheart, maybe you should double-check. Sometimes the print is confusing. Economy is right down that aisle." She gestured casually toward the back of the plane, as if sending someone home after a party. For a moment, Elena said nothing. The words stung, not because she hadn't heard them before, but because they were always delivered the same way, with certainty, with the kind of certainty that came from a lifetime of privilege, from never being doubted, never being told you don't belong. She inhaled, steadying herself. "This is my seat," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Well, if you don't move, I'll have to get the flight attendants. I don't want to make a scene. But—" She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. A scene. The word carried weight. Elena knew how quickly a scene could turn against someone like her. She had seen it happen to friends, colleagues, strangers in news headlines. But as she sat there, the leather cool beneath her hands, she also knew this moment wasn't just about a seat. A flight attendant hurried over, smiling tightly, sensing trouble. "Ladies, is everything all right?" Margaret spoke first. "This woman is in my seat." The attendant looked down at Elena, then at Margaret. There was a flicker of hesitation, the briefest pause, before she turned toward Elena. "Ma'am, could I see your boarding pass?" Elena handed it over without a word. The attendant glanced at it, then at the seat. "This says two-way." "Yes," Elena said softly. Margaret leaned in, her voice low but sharp enough to slice. "Do you really belong here?" The cabin seemed to still. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A young couple whispered to each other. The tension wrapped itself around the row like a storm cloud. Elena's heart thudded once, heavy, but her face remained serene. She thought of her father's voice telling her when she was 12, after she had been turned away from a local swimming pool. "You hold your ground. Even if they say you don't belong, you know you do." She turned back to the window, sunlight glinting off the wing outside, and said quietly but clearly, "Yes, I belong here." The engines roared louder as the plane prepared for departure. The flight attendant shifted uneasily, unsure of what to do next. Margaret straightened her jacket, her jaw tight. The air in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was charged. Waiting for what? No one yet knew. The first-class cabin was designed for comfort, but tension had stripped it of ease. The air seemed heavier now, as if everyone inside had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Elena Carter sat still in her window seat, her boarding pass already verified. The flight attendant lingered awkwardly, clutching the slip of paper as though it might offer a different answer if she stared long enough. But the seat was clear. The boarding pass matched. There was no mistake. And yet Margaret Whitmore remained planted in the aisle, refusing to budge, her hand resting on the headrest of the seat as if to claim it by touch alone. Her perfume, something sharp and floral, drifted into the space between them, invasive, unyielding. "I don't think you understand," Margaret said finally, her voice loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. "This is not about the paper. This is about respect, and I don't appreciate being disrespected." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A businessman in 3B pulled off his headphones, watching now with open curiosity. A young woman in 1C scrolled her phone slower, listening. Elena looked up, her expression calm. "Respect is not asking someone to leave the seat that belongs to them," she said softly. The words carried weight. They landed not only on Margaret, but on the other passengers, who shifted uncomfortably, as though they too felt the sting of truth. Margaret's cheeks flushed. "Young lady, I have flown this route more times than I can count. I know this seat. I always sit here. Always." Elena could have responded with a dozen facts. She could have pulled up her frequent flyer account, her travel history, her corporate credentials, but she chose silence instead, because silence, held steady, could be louder than protest. The flight attendant glanced at Margaret, then at Elena, then back again. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "the boarding pass does list this seat as Ms. Carter's." Margaret's jaw set. "Then move me somewhere else. I won't sit in the back. Do you know who I am?" The familiar phrase. It always landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Do you know who I am?" Helena felt the echo of those words, remembering how often she had heard them spoken in different ways, at conferences, at restaurants, even in boardrooms. a phrase not of introduction, but of hierarchy. The attendant hesitated. "I'll check with the gate agents," she murmured, excusing herself. As she left, Margaret leaned closer, her voice low but cutting. "You're making this harder than it has to be. Why don't you just save yourself the embarrassment?" Embarrassment. That was the weapon. Not fists, not shouts, but the suggestion that Elena's very presence in that seat was shameful. Elena's mind flickered through memories she usually kept locked away. Being followed by a store clerk at age 16. Being asked if she was the help at a college event. The boardroom where a senior executive mistook her for an assistant, handing her his empty coffee cup. Each moment had been a small theft, a seat taken, a place denied, a belonging questioned. Each one left a bruise invisible to others but deeply felt. She straightened, her voice even. "There is no embarrassment in sitting where you belong." The businessman in 3B nodded slightly, as though agreeing. The young woman in 1C raised her eyes, meeting Elena's with a look that said, quietly, "I see you," but Margaret only scoffed. "We'll see how long that lasts." The flight attendant returned, joined now by a male supervisor in a navy vest. He wore the kind of forced smile people put on when they're walking into a storm. "Ladies," he began, "let's resolve this quickly. Ms. Whitmore, your boarding pass actually shows 4D. It seems there was a mix-up." Margaret snapped her fingers. "Dismissive. That must be wrong. I always sit here." The supervisor's smile strained. "I assure you, the boarding pass is correct." Elena felt the eyes of the cabin press upon her. The story was no longer private. It had become theater, unwillingly staged. She thought again of her father's words, thought of the cost of standing her ground. Would this escalate further? Would she become the headline instead of the human being? She was. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained composed. She turned back to the window, grounding herself in the view of the runway. The sky stretched wide and blue, clouds drifting like slow ships. She breathed in deeply, reminding herself she was not alone, even if in this moment she stood solitary. Margaret's voice broke the quiet. "I'm not moving until I get what I paid for. Do you know the money I spend with this airline?" The supervisor's expression flickered. Money had a way of bending rules. Elena knew. It had bent them before, countless times. Her hands rested on her lap. Still, inside, a tide rose. She wanted to shout, to name the injustice, to shake the walls of this aircraft until every passenger acknowledged what was happening, but she didn't. Instead, she chose her words carefully. "This is not about money," Elena said, her tone steady. "It's about truth. The truth is simple. This is my seat." The cabin hushed. The engines hummed beneath their feet, as though even the plane itself was listening. For the first time, Margaret faltered. The sharpness in her eyes dulled for a flicker of a second, replaced by something almost like doubt, but pride recovered quickly, hardening her face once more. The supervisor sighed, rubbing his temple. "Ms. Whitmore, please, let's avoid further delay. We have a full flight, and we need to prepare for takeoff." Margaret huffed, muttering under her breath, but finally stepped back. She didn't retreat far, just enough to keep her claim hovering in the air, unyielding. Elena sat motionless, the storm still rumbling beneath her calm exterior. She wondered how many more times she would have to fight for what was already hers. How many more battles would be disguised as misunderstandings, clerical errors, simple mix-ups. Outside, the afternoon sun glared bright against the tarmac. Passengers shifted. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. But the echo of the confrontation lingered. Everyone had witnessed it. Everyone had felt it. And though the argument seemed to pause, Elena knew the storm had only gathered. The real turbulence had yet to begin. The cabin had quieted, but it was not peace. It was the kind of silence that hummed with nerves. A silence filled with stolen glances and unspoken judgments. Everyone had seen what happened. Everyone had chosen a side, even if they never voiced it. Elena Carter stayed in her seat by the window, her posture upright, her breathing steady. She had long practiced the art of stillness, knowing that stillness could be more powerful than motion. But her stillness now was a shield, a way of holding the storm inside without letting it break the surface. Margaret Whitmore stood only a few feet away, her body stiff, arms crossed tightly. She wasn't used to being denied. She wasn't used to being told no. Her presence radiated defiance, as though she might bend the world around her if she glared hard enough. The supervisor had retreated, muttering about checking the manifest again. But the damage was already done. The conflict had roots now, sinking deep into the collective mood of the plane. A voice broke the hush. "Unbelievable," muttered a man from the middle row. His tone was loud enough to carry, holding up the whole flight over this nonsense. Margaret turned toward him with a triumphant look, as if he had joined her side. "Exactly. It's absurd." Elena heard the words. They slid under her skin, sharp as glass. This nonsense, as though her right to sit where she belonged was nonsense. She closed her eyes briefly, letting her mind slip back to another memory. She was 22, fresh out of college, interviewing for an entry-level position at a financial firm. She had worn her best suit, prepared for every possible question. Yet the first question wasn't about her resume. It was, "Are you here for the clerical role?" It had been the first of many times she was miscast, misplaced, underestimated, but she had pressed on. She had climbed. And now, here she was, still being told the same message in a different form. "Do you really belong here?" Her eyes opened again, steady. She would not surrender. The young woman in seat 1C leaned slightly back, speaking in a low voice meant for Elena alone. "Don't let her push you." Her words were simple, but her gaze held something fierce, something supportive. Elena inclined her head slightly, an acknowledgement. Even a small thread of solidarity mattered. But Margaret caught the exchange and bristled. "Oh, so now you're recruiting allies. What a spectacle." Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "You're making yourself look foolish. My dear." The word dear grated. It was the kind of word that came wrapped in condescension, a velvet cover for disdain. Elena finally turned fully toward her, her voice low but audible. "What looks foolish is insisting something belongs to you when it does not." Margaret's face flushed crimson. For a moment, her mouth opened, but no words came out. Then she snapped, "This isn't over." The businessman in 3B shifted in his seat, his tone dry. "For the love of God, just sit down somewhere." The tension rippled again, voices rising from different corners of the cabin. Some murmured agreement, others whispered discomfort. It was no longer a private battle. It was becoming public theater, and every passenger was an audience member with their own interpretation. The flight attendant returned, her face drawn. "Ladies, please, we need to prepare for takeoff. Miss Whitmore, your assigned seat is 4D. Ms. Carter is correctly seated." Margaret's voice cut sharp. "I don't care what the ticket says. This is my spot. I always sit here. I know the staff. I know the airline. And I know the respect I deserve." Respect. That word again, twisted into a weapon. Respect demanded not as mutual courtesy, but as tribute. Elena's heart beat steadily, though her palms felt damp against the armrest. She wrestled with the thought that perhaps, if she stood now, she could end this ordeal. But what would that cost? It would not be just a seat. It would be a piece of her dignity, another slice taken from her after a lifetime of cuts. Her father's voice echoed again in her mind. If you give it up once, they'll ask you to give it up again. Hold your place. Elena, hold it for yourself and for those who come after you. Her throat tightened, but she lifted her chin. I will not move, she said. The attendant faltered. Margaret sneered. Then maybe we should call security. Is that what you want? To be dragged out in front of everyone? The word dragged hung heavy. Passengers stiffened. They had all seen videos, all read the headlines of black passengers removed violently from flights, their dignity shredded before the world. Elena felt the fear claw at her, real and undeniable. She imagined the cold grip of hands on her arms, the sting of humiliation, the headlines that would reduce her identity to a spectacle. But beneath the fear was something stronger, resolve. If you call security, she said calmly, they will still find my name on this seat. They will still see that I belong here. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Passengers shifted, whispering. Some nodded quietly. A ripple of empathy spread, small but visible. Margaret laughed again. Hollow. We'll see about that. The engines hummed louder. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Routine, cheerful, announcing a slight delay in departure. But the words felt ironic. Everyone knew the delay had a face, had a cause, had a name. Elena stared at the window again, her reflection faint against the glass. In her reflection she saw not just herself, but all the versions of herself who had been told no. The girl at the pool, the young woman in the interview, the professional in the boardroom mistaken for an assistant. And now, the CEO in first class, still being told she didn't belong. She thought of what it meant to yield, what it meant to resist, and slowly, steadily, she chose her answer. She stayed. The aircraft door closed with a heavy thud. That sound usually signaled the start of a journey, a small comfort for frequent travelers who knew it meant the flight was finally underway. But this time it sounded more like a lock, a confinement. Everyone inside the cabin was now trapped with the conflict that had taken root in row 2. Elena Carter sat perfectly still in seat 2A, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Outwardly she appeared calm, but her chest rose and fell with steady effort. Inside her, 1,000 voices wrestled. The temptation to surrender, to give up her seat, whispered in one ear. The memory of every indignity she had endured shouted in the other. Margaret Whitmore had not budged. She remained standing in the aisle, her posture rigid, her glare fixed on Elena as though sheer will could dislodge her. Every now and then she glanced around, seeking validation from the other passengers. Some avoided her gaze, but others offered nods or sympathetic murmurs, feeding her entitlement. The flight attendant reappeared, her smile brittle. Ladies, we really do need to settle this. We can't take off till everyone is seated. Margaret pounced on the opening. Then move her, she snapped. This is wasting everyone's time. A few passengers muttered agreement. Elena heard the impatience in their voices. It wasn't directed entirely at her, but the weight of it pressed down nonetheless. She could feel the calculation in their eyes. One woman should just move so we can all leave. She knew what they didn't know. To them, This was just a seat. To her, it was something else entirely. It was the culmination of years of battles unseen, the embodiment of dignity hard won. If she gave it up now, she wouldn't just be moving a few feet back. She would be stepping back into every stereotype that had tried to contain her. The supervisor in the navy vest returned, his voice more clipped now. "We can reseat one of you," he said, addressing Elena more than Margaret. "Ma'am, we have availability in premium economy. We'll provide compensation." The offer hung in the air like a lure. Premium economy. Compensation. A polite way of saying, "Please, make this easier for us." Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel her pulse in her temples. Premium economy would still be comfortable. It would end the confrontation. The flight could finally take off. But then she saw her father again, standing by the chain-link fence of that pool, his face set in quiet grief as the lifeguard told them they weren't allowed inside. She heard her mother's voice the night she was rejected from a scholarship program, telling her to keep her head high. Her hands tightened on the armrests. "No," she said simply. The supervisor blinked. "Excuse me, I will not move," Elena repeated. Her tone was calm, measured, but it carried enough strength to silence the murmurs around her. Margaret laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Stubbornness isn't dignity, dear. It's arrogance." Elena turned to look at her directly. "Dignity is knowing when not to yield." For the first time, Margaret faltered. The cabin seemed to lean in closer, as though everyone was holding their breath. The supervisor exhaled heavily. "Then I'll have to escalate this." He pulled out a small radio, murmuring into it. The words were soft, but the implication was loud security. A chill ran through Elena. She imagined uniformed officers marching down the aisle, imagined being pulled from her seat, imagined cameras recording every second. She could see the headlines, "Disruptive passenger removed from flight." She could hear the commentary, the questions, the judgments. Her throat tightened. Fear pressed hard against her resolve. She wanted to move. God, she wanted to. But she stayed. The young woman in seat 1C leaned closer again, her voice a whisper. "You're not wrong. Don't let them make you feel small." Those words were a lifeline, fragile but real. Elena grasped them silently, letting them anchor her. Margaret rolled her eyes dramatically. "This is ridiculous. If this airline knew what was good for them, they'd listen to me. I've invested more into this company than she ever has." Elena almost laughed at the irony, but the sound caught in her chest. She thought of the countless hours she had poured into the very airline Margaret claimed to know so well. She thought of the contracts, the negotiations, the risks she had taken to secure its future. She thought, but she did not yet reveal. The engines rumbled faintly as ground crew finished preparations. Passengers fidgeted, restless, anxious to be in the air. The tension had stretched long enough that it was now part of the flight itself, woven into the fabric of the journey before it had even begun. The supervisor lowered his radio, his voice strained. "Security will meet us if this isn't resolved before pushback. Please, let's avoid that." Elena's chest rose and fell once more. Slowly, she placed her boarding pass on the tray table in front of her. "This seat is mine," she said. "If security comes, they will see that too." Her calmness was disarming. Even Margaret, so fueled by outrage, seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. Passengers shifted. The businessman in 3B muttered under his breath, but softer this time. The young woman in 1C gave the slightest smile of encouragement. The flight attendant's face softened, though her words remained careful. Let's all take a breath. We'll find a solution. But the truth was clear. A solution that satisfied both women did not exist. The conflict could only break one way. Elena knew that. Margaret knew that. The cabin knew that. And the breaking point was drawing near. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for departure. But the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. The hum of the engines underfoot felt like a second heartbeat, pulsing with the tension that had wrapped itself around every row. Elena Carter sat rigidly in seat 2A. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, but her mind was a storm. She had fought many battles in her life, most invisible, most unacknowledged, but this one was playing out under the gaze of dozens of strangers. She could feel their eyes, the weight of their impatience. Some saw her as a nuisance, others as a symbol, but very few seemed to see her as simply a woman trying to sit in the seat she had paid for. Margaret Whitmore remained standing in the aisle, her presence dominating the space. She had crossed her arms again, the diamonds at her ears catching the cabin light. Every shift of her posture radiated indignation, as though her very bones rejected the idea of compromise. The supervisor's radio crackled faintly at his side. He leaned closer to the flight attendant, whispering something Elena couldn't quite hear. But she caught fragments: security, delay, compliance. The words swirled together, each one a threat pressing harder against her resolve. Her heart thudded in her chest. She had seen those videos, men and women dragged from flights, faces plastered across news sites, lives reduced to headlines. She imagined her own image there. Black woman disrupts flight. She imagined the think pieces, the comment sections, the cruel interpretations. Fear clawed at her ribs. For the briefest moment, Elena thought about standing, about walking back down the aisle, letting Margaret claim victory, letting the flight finally take off. No one would applaud her for it, but at least the spotlight would dim. At least the humiliation would be quieter. Her eyes drifted toward the aisle, and she pictured herself rising, moving aside. The thought made her stomach twist. And then she remembered her mother's face on the day Elena became the first in her family to graduate college. She remembered her father's hands, worn from work, clapping proudly when she walked across that stage. She remembered the young interns who looked at her now with hope in their eyes, waiting to see if the path was survivable. If she moved, what lesson would she leave them? Her jaw tightened. She gripped the armrest, grounding herself. The flight attendant spoke again, her tone a careful mixture of patience and authority. "Ladies, we must settle this immediately. The captain cannot take off until every passenger is seated." Margaret gestured toward Elena, her voice ringing with triumph. "Then remove her. Call security if you have to." Gas flickered through the cabin. The businessman in 3B muttered a curse under his breath. The young woman in 1C shook her head in disbelief. Elena felt the words sink into her skin. Remove her, as if she were not a paying passenger, as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be respected. Her throat tightened, her pulse hammered. For a moment, her body betrayed her. Her legs twitched with the urge to stand, to flee before the humiliation became unbearable. But then she remembered the words she had spoken to a group of young employees only a month ago. Sometimes, the hardest part of leadership is simply staying in the room when the room wants you gone. Now she was not just in the room, she was in the seat, and the seat had become the stage. The supervisor raised his radio again. "I need security to meet us at the gate." The words cut like a blade. Elena's breath caught. This was it, the breaking point. Her eyes darted toward the window, the runway glimmering in the afternoon sun. She could almost see her reflection there, a shadow of herself superimposed against the sky. And she asked herself, silently but fiercely, "Who are you? Elena Carter. What will you choose?" The silence stretched. Margaret smirked, convinced she had won. The passengers murmured, a chorus of impatience and unease. The crew waited, their authority trembling. Elena drew in a deep breath. She felt the storm inside her, the fear, the doubt, the weight of history pressing down. And then she felt something else, an ember, steady and unyielding. She turned to the supervisor, her voice quiet but sharp as steel. "If security comes, they will find that my boarding pass says 2A. They will find that I am exactly where I belong. And they will have to explain to the world why a woman was asked to leave her rightful seat." The words rang through the cabin. They silenced even the murmurs. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the young woman in 1C said clearly, "She's right." The businessman in 3B added, reluctantly but firmly, "She's in her seat. Let's move on." The ripple spread, small at first, then wider. Passengers nodded, muttered agreements. The tide was shifting, if only slightly. Margaret bristled, her face tight with disbelief. She opened her mouth to retort, but the momentum had changed. She no longer had the cabin entirely on her side. The supervisor hesitated, his radio still in his hand. His eyes darted between Elena, Margaret, and the other passengers. He looked suddenly tired, as though realizing that whichever choice he made would echo beyond this flight. The engines hummed louder, impatient. The plane was ready. The question was whether the people were. Elena sat back, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the window. Inside, she still trembled. Fear hadn't vanished, but courage was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to stay seated anyway. And in that moment, Elena knew she would not surrender. The tension in the cabin was a living thing now, pressing against the walls, thickening the air. Passengers sat in uneasy silence, as though they had all agreed without speaking that no one should move too suddenly, no one should speak too loudly. Elena Carter remained in seat 2A, still and composed, though her heart raced like the engines beneath them. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time, some of the passengers had echoed it. But the threat of security still loomed. The supervisor clutched his radio, uncertain. Margaret Whitmore hovered like a storm cloud, unwilling to yield, convinced the sky itself bent in her favor. And then, as if the plane itself had grown weary of the stalemate, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richard Hayes. We'll be pushing back shortly. Before we depart, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on board." The cabin stilled even further. Heads lifted, eyes darted. The captain's calm, steady voice rolled through the speakers, impossible to ignore. "Today, our airline has the honor of flying with its new chief executive officer. Ms. Elena Carter is joining us on this flight. Please join me in welcoming her." The words dropped like a stone into a pond. The ripples spread instantly, visibly, through every row. Elena closed her eyes briefly, a soft exhale slipping past her lips. She had not planned this, had not asked for it. Yet here it was, her identity laid bare in the most public way possible. Gas filled the cabin. A man near the back muttered, "CEO." Another passenger clapped once, uncertainly, before stopping in the silence that followed. Margaret's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at Elena as though seeing her for the first time, as though the very fabric of reality had betrayed her. The supervisor froze, his radio slack in his hand. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, as though recalibrating her entire understanding of the last 30 minutes. Elena did not move. She kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching the ground crew waving their batons, the sunlight glinting off the wing. She let the silence work, let the truth unfurl around her without a word. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out thin and shaky. That can't be right. The businessman in 3B let out a low whistle. Guess you picked the wrong fight. Laughter bubbled from somewhere behind them, sharp and incredulous. A wave of murmurs followed, passengers leaning into one another, whispering furiously. The young woman in 1C smiled openly now, pride in her eyes as she looked at Elena. I knew you were right to stay. Margaret stumbled, literally stumbling back a step as though the floor had shifted beneath her. She reached for the seat back to steady herself, her eyes darting wildly between Elena, the crew, and the other passengers. But she doesn't look. She cut herself off, realizing too late how the sentence would have ended. The unfinished thought hung in the air, louder than if she had spoken it. Elena finally turned her head, meeting Margaret's eyes with calm clarity. Her voice was low, deliberate. What doesn't she look like? Margaret. The question was not shouted. It didn't need to be. Its weight pressed down on everyone who heard it. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no answer came. She sank into silence, her power evaporating under the scrutiny of dozens of watching eyes. The supervisor cleared his throat, his voice suddenly deferential. Ms. Carter, please accept our apologies for the inconvenience. Elena inclined her head slightly. Your apology is noted. The shift was seismic. Where moments ago Elena had been on the verge of removal, now the authority bent toward her. The hierarchy had been rewritten with the truth of her identity. Margaret collapsed into her assigned seat in 4D, her movements stiff, her expression stunned. She no longer held the cabin's attention as a figure of authority. Now she was only a cautionary tale. Passengers began clapping, scattered at first, then gathering force. It wasn't the polite applause given to a celebrity sighting. It was something deeper, more visceral, relief, vindication, admiration. Elena absorbed it quietly, her eyes drifting back to the window. The clapping faded, replaced by the usual pre-flight bustle. Yet the atmosphere had changed entirely. The air was lighter, charged not with tension, but with revelation. Still, Elena's chest remained tight. The twist had freed her from the threat of removal, but it hadn't erased the wound. The insult still lingered, raw and real. She thought of all the times her identity had been questioned, diminished, erased. This time, the truth had risen visibly, undeniably. But what about the countless others who carried their dignity quietly, without titles or platforms to defend them, who defended them when the world questioned their right to belong? Her jaw tightened. She knew the applause was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a larger one. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Margaret sat stiff and silent, staring down at her folded hands. The supervisor and attendant busied themselves with checklists, avoiding Elena's gaze. Passengers whispered, replaying the moment, building the story they would later tell friends and family. Elena sat still, her hands folded, her heart slowly steadying. The truth had been revealed. The storm had broken. But the echoes of what had almost happened remained, and they carried with them a weight she would not soon set down. For now, though, she allowed herself one small victory. She had not moved. She had held her place, and in doing so, She had shown everyone watching what dignity looked like when it refused to yield. The cabin had shifted. The tension that once pressed down like a storm cloud had lifted, replaced by a new kind of charge expectant, watchful, alive. Passengers were no longer simply witnesses. They were participants, their eyes wide, their silence heavy with anticipation. Elena Carter remained seated in 2A, her back straight, her gaze calm. The announcement from Captain Hayes still echoed in the air, and with it, the revelation of who she truly was. For the first time in half an hour, she felt the weight of the confrontation tilt not in her favor exactly, but toward the truth. Margaret Whitmore sat frozen in 4D, her body stiff, her lips pressed tightly together. She looked as though she had been carved from stone. Her earlier confidence shattered. The diamonds at her ears sparkled under the cabin lights, but the brilliance no longer commanded respect. Passengers whispered softly, their voices weaving into a low hum that carried an edge of disbelief. "She's the CEO, unreal. Did you see her face?" The murmurs rippled, each retelling a small act of vindication. And then the silence returned, waiting, as if everyone sensed that one final act was yet to unfold. Elena turned her head slowly toward Margaret. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it carried like a clear bell through the cabin. "This seat was never yours to take. Margaret, not today, not ever." The words hung suspended in the air, stark and undeniable. Margaret's face flushed. She shifted in her seat, searching for a reply. But nothing came. Her earlier bravado had vanished, leaving only fragments of pride she clutched desperately. Elena did not look away. Her calm was not cruel, it was resolute, an assertion of dignity that went beyond one woman and one chair. It was a voice echoing through time, speaking for every person who had ever been told to move, to shrink, to disappear. The businessman in 3B leaned forward, his expression solemn now. He nodded once, as if acknowledging not just Elena's words, but the truth they carried. The young woman in 1C smiled openly, pride in her eyes. Margaret finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Elena tilted her head slightly. "And if I hadn't been the CEO, would that have made your demand acceptable?" The question sliced cleanly through the air. Some passengers inhaled sharply. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Margaret faltered. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her gaze dropping to her folded hands. The diamonds in her ears glittered like cold stars, but they no longer meant anything. Elena continued, her tone still calm, almost gentle. "Respect doesn't depend on titles. Dignity doesn't depend on status. It belongs to every human being. You tried to take mine, Margaret, but you failed." The clapping began softly, almost uncertainly, from somewhere behind them. Then another pair of hands joined in, and another. Within seconds, the sound swelled, echoing through the cabin. It wasn't the polite applause given at the end of a speech. It was raw, emotional, fueled by something deeper. Relief, justice, recognition. Elena sat quietly as the sound washed over her. She hadn't sought it, hadn't wanted spectacle. But the applause wasn't for her alone. It was for what she represented, for what she had defended by simply refusing to move. Margaret sat rigid, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the seat in front of her. The applause seemed to push her further into silence, until she was almost swallowed by it. The supervisor cleared his throat, his earlier authority replaced with deference. "Ms. Carter, on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize again for what happened. This should never have escalated the way it did. Elena inclined her head, accepting the words but offering none in return. Her silence was its own kind of statement. The applause faded slowly, leaving behind a cabin transformed. Conversations resumed, but softer, gentler. People looked at Elena differently now, with a mixture of respect and reflection. She turned back to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. She saw her own face, steady, and behind it the faint outlines of the clouds beginning to gather outside. She thought of how close she had come to yielding, how strong the temptation had been, and she thought of how easy it would have been to disappear quietly, as so many before her had been forced to do. But she hadn't. She had stayed. Her eyes flicked back toward Margaret, who remained motionless in 4D. Elena felt no triumph, no gloating, only a quiet certainty. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth, she whispered to herself, barely audible. We all belong. The words weren't meant for Margaret. They were meant for herself, for the passengers, for anyone who had ever doubted their right to a seat at the table or in the sky. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Seat belts clicked, overhead bins latched. Safety announcements echoed, yet nothing felt the same. Everyone carried the weight of what they had witnessed, each passenger now a keeper of the story. And Elena knew the story wouldn't stay inside this plane. It would travel, like all stories do. It would be told and retold, reshaped in each retelling. But at its core, it would hold the truth. One woman refused to move, and in doing so, reminded everyone what dignity looks like. The roar of the engines deepened, vibrating through the floor and the armrests, signaling that the plane was finally rolling toward the runway. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some relieved, some still buzzing from what they had witnessed. The cabin crew moved briskly through the aisles, securing last-minute details. The confrontation that had consumed the last half hour was over, but its echoes remained in the silence between people's words. Elena Carter sat still in 2A, her seat belt fastened, her hands folded in her lap. Her posture was calm, her face serene, but inside she carried the weight of it all. She felt the shift in the cabin, people looking at her with newfound respect, even awe, but that didn't erase the sting of Margaret's words, or the way the crew had doubted her so quickly. She turned her face toward the window. The afternoon sun stretched across the tarmac, washing everything in gold. She watched as the plane's shadow slid over the ground, lengthening, shifting, preparing to lift away. As the plane gathered speed, Elena's mind drifted. The vibration of takeoff always reminded her of being a little girl again, sitting in the back seat of her father's old Chevy as it rumbled down the road. She would close her eyes. Imagine the car was an airplane. Imagine it carrying her far away from the small town where everyone seemed to know her place before she did. She remembered that pool. She was 12, standing in line with her friends on a sweltering July afternoon. Her swimsuit was blue, a hand-me-down from her cousin, and she clutched a towel too big for her thin frame. She had been excited all week, saving allowance money for the entrance fee. But when it was her turn at the gate, the lifeguard's smile faltered. "Not today," he said. "Private event." Behind her, she heard a chuckle. One of the older boys muttered, "They just don't want you here." She had turned to her father, confusion heavy in her chest. He had stood tall, his jaw clenched, his voice calm but firm as he said, "Come on, Lena, we'll go somewhere else." But she had seen his eyes. She had seen the quiet grief there, the helplessness of a man who wanted to give his daughter the world and knew how often the world would deny her. That day, they drove to the lake instead. She remembered sitting in the shallow water, the mud squishing between her toes, pretending not to care. But something had shifted inside her, a seed planted, a knowledge that dignity could be taken without a word, without a raised hand, just a closed gate. The plane lifted off, pressing her gently back against her seat. Elena blinked, pulled from memory by the sudden tilt of the horizon outside the window. The city shrank beneath them, streets and rooftops folding into patterns like quilt squares. She thought of the scholarship she hadn't received in high school, though her grades had been flawless. The letter had said competitive pool of applicants, but the local committee member had let it slip to her teacher. She's not the kind of student we're looking for. She thought of her first corporate job, walking into a conference room carrying her notebook, only to have a senior executive hand her his empty coffee cup, with a smile that said he thought she was the assistant. Each memory was a bruise. Each bruise was a reminder. And yet here she was, decades later, the CEO of an airline, sitting in 2A as the engines roared. The irony was sharp, almost bitter. Even now, with all she had built, she had been seconds away from being forced out of her rightful seat. Her eyes flicked toward Margaret in 4D. The woman sat rigid, staring straight ahead, her face pale. Elena felt no triumph, no satisfaction in Margaret's silence. She felt only a familiar heaviness, because this wasn't about one woman in one cabin. It was about the pattern. It was about the way society still tilted, still questioned, still denied. The young woman in 1C shifted slightly, catching Elena's eye. She offered a small smile, the kind that said, "I see you. I'm with you." Elena returned the smile faintly. That, at least, was something. A thread of solidarity, fragile but real. The seatbelt sign dinged softly overhead. The plane leveled off, slipping into the quiet rhythm of flight. Around her, passengers reached for magazines, headphones, drinks. Life resumed its normal pace. But Elena's mind remained in the past, sifting through memories like stones in her pocket. She closed her eyes, hearing her father's voice again. "You hold your place, Lena. Even if they tell you not to, even if they try to push you out, you hold it." Her chest tightened. She whispered to herself, so soft no one else could hear, "I did. Daddy, I held it." A warmth spread through her, bittersweet. The confrontation was over, but the battle was not. It never truly was. Still. As she looked again out the window at the endless sky stretching before her, she felt a quiet resolve. Maybe this moment, witnessed by dozens of strangers, would ripple outward. Maybe it would remind someone else, somewhere else, to hold their place too. And that, she thought, was worth the wait. By the time the plane touched down in Dallas, the story had already begun to escape the cabin. Passengers, unable to contain what they had seen, typed furiously on their phones the moment the wheels hit the runway. Words poured out into text messages, tweets, Facebook posts, LinkedIn updates. Each version of the story was slightly different, colored by the angle of the witness, but they all carried the same core: a woman had tried to strip another of her seat, and the woman refused to move. Elena Carter moved calmly through the arrival gate, her leather bag over her shoulder, her steps even. She could feel eyes on her. The same passengers who had applauded her still watched, some hesitantly, some with quiet admiration. A few even approached her, but she only offered polite nods, keeping her dignity wrapped tight like a cloak. Margaret Whitmore walked quickly in the opposite direction, sunglasses on, her lips pressed tight. She moved with the air of someone desperate to disappear, but the whispers followed her like shadows. Some passengers lifted their phones discreetly, snapping photos. Margaret's attempt at anonymity was already lost. Within hours, the first social media post went viral. A young woman seat 1C shared a thread on Twitter. She wrote about the confrontation, about how Elena had stayed calm, about the shocking twist when the pilot revealed she was the CEO. Her words were simple but powerful. Today, I watched a black woman hold her place when the world told her she didn't belong. She reminded us all that dignity is not negotiable. The thread spread like wildfire. Thousands of retweets, thousands of comments. Some shared their own stories of humiliation, of being told to move, of being asked if they belonged. Others simply wrote, "Thank you, Elena," as though speaking directly to her. News outlets picked it up next. Local stations ran with the headline first, then national networks followed. Airline CEO faces discrimination on her own flight. The irony was too sharp to ignore. Talk shows debated it. Commentators weighed in. Panelists argued late into the night. Elena watched it all unfold from the quiet of her hotel room. She sat on the edge of the bed, the glow of the television flickering across her face. The anchor's voice was steady as he replayed the story, each clip of passenger testimony piecing together the mosaic of what had happened. She felt an odd detachment. The woman on the screen didn't quite feel like her. It felt like a character, a symbol. Yet she knew it was her face, her name, her story now stitched into the fabric of public discourse. Margaret Whitmore's name surfaced quickly. Passengers had whispered it. Reporters had confirmed it. She was identified as a former investor, a woman long known in wealthy circles. The backlash was swift. Editorials condemned her behavior. Her business associates distanced themselves. She became a public cautionary tale, her reputation unraveling as quickly as Elena's was rising. But Elena didn't rejoice. Watching Margaret's image plastered across news sites, watching her stumble under the weight of criticism, Elena felt only a quiet heaviness. Humiliation was not justice. What mattered was not Margaret's fall, but the truth that had been revealed, that dignity still had to be defended, even by those who had seemingly already earned it. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. Messages poured in colleagues, friends, strangers. Some congratulated her, some thanked her, some begged for interviews. She let most of them go unanswered. Instead, she thought of the interns in her company, the young women who watched her closely, waiting to see how she carried herself in storms like this. She thought of her parents, long gone now, who had planted the seeds of resilience that carried her through. And she thought of the girl at the pool, the girl she had once been, told she didn't belong. That girl lived in every headline, in every retweet, in every whispered thank you. The next morning, as she prepared for her board meeting, the hotel lobby buzzed with more than business chatter. Guests glanced her way, whispering. Some approached her timidly. A middle-aged black woman clasped her hand and said softly, "You gave me something yesterday." "Thank you." Elena squeezed her hand gently. "We give each other strength," she replied. Outside, cameras waited. Reporters shouted questions. "Ms. Carter, how did it feel? Did you plan to make a stand?" "What do you say to people who see you as a role model now?" she answered sparingly, her voice steady. "I didn't plan anything. I simply sat where I belonged. That's all any of us should ever need to do." The microphones captured it. The sound bites traveled far. By evening, she was no longer just a CEO. She was being called something else, a symbol. Some headlines named her the woman who refused to move. Others dubbed her the CEO in seat 2A. Elena Carter read none of them closely. She understood the power of narrative, understood how quickly it could carry someone beyond their own control, but she also understood the responsibility. If people saw her as a symbol, then perhaps she could use that spotlight to shine on others, to turn attention not just to her own story, but to the countless others who had been silenced. Margaret, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. Statements were issued on her behalf, apologies written in polished language, but they rang hollow. The public had already made up its mind. Elena sat by the hotel window that night, gazing out at the Dallas skyline, lights glittering like stars scattered across the earth. She thought again of her father's words, of the fence at the pool, of the coffee cup handed to her by mistake, of every bruise that had shaped her. This moment was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." And as the city hummed below, Elena whispered into the quiet, "We belong everywhere." The auditorium in Washington, D.C., was filled to capacity. Rows of polished wooden chairs stretched beneath the glow of soft stage lights. Journalists clustered near the front, their cameras already trained on the podium. Executives, students, activists, and everyday citizens filled the seats, murmuring in anticipation. The story of Seat 2A had spread beyond the walls of one plane. Now it belonged to the nation. Elena Carter stood backstage, her hands loosely clasped in front of her. She wore a simple navy dress, understated yet commanding. No diamonds, no flash. She had chosen her outfit deliberately. She wanted the words to shine, not the fabric. Her communications team whispered last-minute notes, reminding her of the talking points they had prepared. But Elena barely heard them. She knew what she needed to say. It was not something that could be scripted by others. It came from too deep inside. A stage manager gave the signal. Elena stepped forward. The applause began immediately, swelling until it filled the room like a tide. She paused at the podium, waiting for the sound to settle. Her eyes scanned the crowd. She saw faces young and old, black and white, men and women. She saw curiosity, admiration, skepticism. She saw hope. When the room quieted, she leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady, carrying clearly to the furthest row. 2 weeks ago, I boarded a flight from New York to Dallas. I sat in my assigned seat, 2A, and a woman told me I didn't belong there. A ripple moved through the audience. People leaned forward, listening. She insisted I move. The crew, at first, asked me to comply. And for a moment, I thought about it. I thought about standing up, walking back down the aisle, disappearing quietly so the flight could continue in peace. But I didn't. I stayed. Her gaze swept the room. She could see heads nodding already. I stayed because that seat wasn't just a seat. It was a place I had paid for. Yes, but it was also a place I had earned, a place I had a right to occupy, simply because I am human, because every one of us has that right to sit where we belong, to exist with dignity, to claim space without apology. The audience grew still, the silence almost reverent. I wish I could tell you that this was the first time I had been told I didn't belong, but it wasn't. I wish I could tell you it will be the last, but I know it won't. Her voice softened, pulling them closer. When I was 12 years old, I was turned away from a swimming pool because of the color of my skin. When I was 22, I walked into a job interview and was mistaken for clerical staff. Even as a professional, even as a leader, I have been handed coffee cups meant for assistants. And 2 weeks ago, even as the CEO of an airline, I was told to move from my own seat. A murmur of recognition moved through the audience. Some lowered their heads. Others wiped at their eyes. Elena paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Then she lifted her chin. But here is what matters. I didn't move, and because I didn't, people saw, people talked, people remembered. Not just me, not just Margaret Whitmore, not just that flight. They remembered themselves. They remembered the times they were told to shrink, to vanish, to accept less, and they remembered how much it hurt. Her voice rose slightly, clear and strong. This story is not about a single confrontation. It is about all of us. It is about the invisible battles fought in classrooms, in boardrooms, in waiting rooms, in the aisles of airplanes. It is about the truth that dignity should never be negotiable. Applause erupted, loud and sustained. Elena waited, hands folded lightly on the podium, until it softened again. She leaned closer, her voice gentle once more. I don't want you to clap for me. I want you to remember the next time you are told you don't belong. Remember that you do. Remember that you have a seat at the table, on the plane, in the world. And remember that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to stay where you are. The words settled like a benediction. Elena let silence linger for a moment, then added, This is not just about race. It is not just about gender. It is about humanity. We cannot build a society of justice if we do not start with respect. We cannot build a future of equality if we do not honor dignity in the present. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters scribbled notes. But in the room, people listened, not as journalists or professionals, but as human beings. Elena's eyes found a young woman in the second row, perhaps 20 years old, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The girl's eyes glistened. Elena held her gaze for a moment, and in that silent exchange she felt the purpose of her words. She closed with quiet finality. I kept my seat, and I hope you will keep yours too. The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered, rolling like a wave that would not recede. Some shouted her name. Some wept openly. Elena stepped back from the podium, her heart steady, her face calm. She had not given them a performance. She had given them the truth. And truth had a way of reaching people where speeches and slogans could not. Backstage, as the applause continued, she allowed herself a single, deep breath. Not relief, resolve. She knew the world would continue to test her. She knew others would still be told to move, but perhaps, because of this, more of them would stay. The reception after Elena's speech buzzed with energy. Clusters of people filled the grand hall, balancing glasses of sparkling water and plates of hors d'oeuvres while replaying her words in animated conversation. Cameras flashed, reporters hovered, executives mingled with students and activists. Yet despite the bustle, the air carried a reverence, as though everyone knew they had just witnessed something larger than a keynote. Elena Carter stood near a window at the edge of the room, her posture relaxed, but her mind still echoing with the weight of the speech. She accepted handshakes, listened to thanks, and offered polite nods. Yet inwardly, she longed for quiet. Public applause was loud, but reflection always whispered. As she turned toward the refreshment table, she noticed a young woman lingering at the edge of the crowd. She couldn't have been older than 19 or 20. her hands clasped in front of her, her posture hesitant. She wore a plain blouse and carried a worn notebook, its cover bent from use. Their eyes met briefly. The young woman looked away quickly. But then, gathering courage, she stepped forward. "Ms. Carter." Her voice was soft, almost uncertain. Elena offered a warm smile. "Yes, I just wanted to thank you." The girl's words tumbled out, shaky but sincere. "Your story, your speech, it felt like you were talking to me." Elena gestured gently toward a quieter corner. "Would you like to sit for a moment?" They found 2 chairs away from the crowd. The girl clutched her notebook tightly, as if it might anchor her. "My name is Jasmine," she said. "I'm a first year at Howard. Pre-law. I almost didn't come tonight. I thought, what difference would it make? Hearing someone speak. But then you stood up there and told your story. And I couldn't stop shaking." Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. "When you said you thought about moving, that you almost did, it felt like you were saying my life out loud. I've spent so much time moving, from clubs at school, from opportunities, from conversations where I was made to feel small. I thought maybe that was just how things were supposed to be." Elena listened quietly, her chest tightening. She saw herself in Jasmine, the same hesitation, the same quiet wounds carried invisibly. Jasmine continued, her voice trembling. "But then you said you stayed. You said dignity isn't negotiable. And I thought if she can do that in front of a plane full of people, maybe I can do it in my life, too. Maybe I don't always have to move." Her words cracked at the end, but they carried a strength that reached deep into Elena's heart. Elena reached across the small table, resting her hand gently on Jasmine's. "You don't have to move, Jasmine. Not for anyone who tells you that you don't belong. You have a seat wherever you choose to be. Don't let the world shrink it for you." Tears slipped down Jasmine's cheeks, but this time she didn't hide them. She opened her notebook with shaking fingers, revealing pages filled with notes, quotes, questions. She had written down Elena's words from the speech, circled and underlined them as though they were scripture. "Can I ask you something?" Jasmine whispered. "Of course. Weren't you afraid?" "On that plane." Elena exhaled softly. She had been asked this by journalists, but never like this, not by someone who needed the truth, not just the soundbite. "Yes," Elena said. "I was terrified. I thought they would drag me out. I thought the world would see me as a problem instead of a person. I thought I would regret it. But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing anyway. And Jasmine, you have that courage in you already. I can see it." The girl's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but then she closed her mouth, holding the words instead. She sat taller, straighter, as though Elena's belief had added weight to her spine. The noise of the reception faded around them. For a few moments, it was just the 2 of them, one woman who had carried battles for decades, and one girl just beginning to fight hers. Jasmine finally whispered, "I want to be like you." Elena shook her head gently. "No, be like you. That's stronger. Take the lessons, yes. Take the stories. But your voice will carry in places mine never will. That's the beauty of it." Jasmine's tears turned into a trembling smile. She closed her notebook carefully, holding it to her chest like a promise. "I'll remember," she said. They stood together. Elena pulled her into a brief embrace, firm and steady. It was not the embrace of a celebrity and a fan. It was one of kinship, of recognition, of passing a torch not through speeches or headlines, but through quiet, human connection. As Jasmine walked away, her shoulders squared. Elena watched her go with a sense of quiet healing. For the first time since that flight, she felt the sting of humiliation ease, replaced by something gentler. The pain had not been erased, but it had been transformed into fuel, into guidance, into hope for someone else. She turned back toward the window, the city lights glimmering beyond the glass. The reflection showed her own face, lined with fatigue, but lit by something deeper. Her father's voice echoed again in memory. "Hold your place, Lena, even if they try to push you out. Hold it." And now, she realized, she wasn't just holding it for herself. She was holding it for Jasmine, and for everyone else who might one day sit where the world told them not to. The thought filled her chest with warmth. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, truly smiled. Weeks passed, yet the story of Seat 2A continued to ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water. The hashtags trended for days. Editorials debated the meaning. High school teachers assigned the story in classrooms. Activists carried it to rallies. Quiet conversations unfolded around kitchen tables and office break rooms, where people admitted their own memories of being told to move, to step aside, to know their place. Elena Carter carried on with her work. Meetings, negotiations, boardrooms, the endless tide of emails and decisions. Outwardly, life resumed its steady pace. Yet something within her had shifted. She was no longer just a leader of a company. She had become, whether she sought it or not, a vessel for something larger. Some evenings, when the day's noise finally quieted, she would sit on her balcony overlooking the city. She would sip tea, watch the lights flicker in the distance, and think of the girl at the pool, the young professional with the coffee cup, the woman in 2A. All of them were her, and all of them were still walking beside her. One evening, she received a letter in the mail, handwritten, not typed. The envelope was plain, the handwriting slightly shaky. She opened it carefully. "Dear Ms. Carter, I was on that flight. I didn't say anything at the time. I wanted to. I wanted to stand up for you. But I stayed quiet because I was afraid of making things worse. I've thought about it every day since. I'm sorry, but I want you to know I'll never stay quiet again." Elena held the letter for a long time, her throat tight. She folded it neatly and placed it in her journal, not as a reminder of regret, but as proof of change. At the next company town hall, she addressed her employees not as their CEO, but as a fellow traveler. "I want to talk about the power of staying in your seat," she began, "not just on airplanes, but in life. Too many of us are asked, directly or indirectly, to move, to make space for someone who feels entitled, to accept less than what we've earned, and too many times we do it quietly because it feels easier. But every time we yield, we reinforce the belief that we don't belong. Every time we stay, we remind the world that we do." Her employees listened intently, some with tears glistening in their eyes. She knew her words mattered more now, because they came not from a position of authority, but from lived truth. Later that evening, she walked through the city streets. It was dusk, and the sky burned orange and violet, the horizon glowing with promise. A group of teenagers passed her, laughing loudly, their energy filling the air. One girl caught sight of her, stopped, and whispered to her friends. They approached shyly. "Are you the CEO from the flight?" one asked. Elena smiled softly. "Yes." The girl grinned. "My mom showed me your story. She said I should never let anyone tell me I don't belong. I just wanted to say thank you." They walked on, their laughter trailing behind them. But Elena stood still for a moment, letting the words sink in. Gratitude. From a stranger. Proof that the story had already taken root where it was needed most. As night fell, Elena returned home. She sat once more on her balcony, the city lights blinking like constellations scattered across the earth. She thought of Jasmine at the reception, of the countless messages and letters she had received, of the faces in the crowd during her speech. The world had not changed overnight. Prejudice still lived in corners both large and small. There would be more battles, more moments of doubt, more gates closed. But she also knew this: every story carried power. Every refusal to move planted a seed. And one day, those seeds would grow into something unstoppable. She closed her eyes, hearing her father's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. "Hold your place, Lena. Even if they tell you not to, hold it." She whispered into the quiet. "I held it, Daddy, and I'll keep holding it." The wind stirred, cool and steady, carrying her words into the night. And as she opened her eyes to the horizon ahead, Elena Carter smiled, not with triumph, but with hope, because she knew that somewhere, someone else was about to face their own choice to move or to stay. And maybe, just maybe, they would remember her story, and they would choose to stay. Life often tests us in small, ordinary places: at a gate, in a meeting, in a waiting room. Sometimes those tests are louder, and sometimes they are silent, disguised as polite requests to step aside. Elena's story reminds us that dignity is not a luxury tied to titles or wealth. It is a birthright, something every person carries simply by being human. For older generations, many of whom have lived through seasons of exclusion and quiet prejudice, this truth feels deeply familiar. You may remember times you were told not to sit, not to speak, not to claim space that was rightfully yours. And yet, by staying, by refusing to yield, you preserved not only your own worth, but also left a legacy for those who came after you. The lesson is simple, but profound courage often looks like stillness. It is the decision to stay seated when the world says move. And every time we stay, we teach others that they too belong. Let us carry this reminder into our daily lives. Respect must start with ourselves, so that we can demand it, gently but firmly, from the world around us. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like Elena's remind us that dignity and respect belong to everyone. If this touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe, so together we can keep these conversations alive and bring more voices to light.